Hey, everybody. If you're listening to this, you are listening to the first free hour of this episode of The Shift with Doug McKenty. If you like what you're hearing, please consider subscribing to the show in order to access the full feature-length versions of the podcast, as well as have access to the members forum, where we discuss potential topics and interviews and dive deep into the overall concept of the shift. For only $6 a month, not only do you get the full-length episodes, but also an opportunity to co-create with me, your host, Doug McKenty, the future of the show. Go to www.theshiftnow.com or patreon.com/theshift and sign up today in order to help make the shift possible. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show. Good morning, noon, or night, whenever and wherever you are listening to The Shift. I'm your host. My name is Doug McKenty. This episode was recorded on February 11th, 2021. Today's program features writer Donald Jeffries. Donald got his start initially researching the many inconsistencies with the mainstream narrative concerning the JFK assassination, and has gone on to publish multiple books, including Hidden History, Crimes and Cover-Ups in American Politics, Survival of the Richest, as well as his most recent work, Bullyocracy. While all of his books broach the topic of an almost hidden hierarchy that controls and exploits the vast majority of the population by influencing and manipulating political power behind the scenes, today's discussion will focus on the bully culture that, though little discussed, may be the principal psychological and cultural characteristic that drives a society defined by the few ruling over the many. In Bullyocracy, Donald takes us back to high school, where he posits the seeds of this social hierarchy are planted, not through the actual education received, but through the proliferation and mostly subconscious perpetuation of a bully culture that is ubiquitous within public schools throughout the United States and much of the world. This culture is based on the near godlike adoration given not just by students, but by many teachers and administrators to the athletes and cheerleaders that make up the popular crowd. In his book, Donald cites example after example of popular students bullying, torturing, and even raping other students with impunity, while receiving extremely light sentences if punished at all. Though many of us look back at our educational experience and remember questioning the purpose of this social construct, most adults within education, law enforcement, journalism, and even the anti-bullying movement are loath to place the blame on the popular kids and the social structures that created them, but instead downplay personal responsibility for these actions as a practical joke gone wrong, a rite of passage for those abused, or even blame the victim for not standing up for themselves. Excuse after excuse is given in the public realm for egregious criminal behavior if performed by a star athlete or popular young woman whose mean girl antics cause serious negative repercussions on an undeserving target. The book goes on to describe how this hierarchy does not stop in high school, but continues to flourish on college campuses, within athletic departments and Greek fraternities and sororities, then into the workplace as bullying personalities rise to the top and social cliques continue to wreak permanent psychological damage on those who, for whatever reason, do not conform to some preconceived notion of superiority. Could the bullyocracy be a foundational characteristic of an essentially tyrannical society, where time and again the 1% is allowed to act without consequences, no matter the damage caused? Could it be that socialization into this unacknowledged hierarchy, starting from a very young age, creates a type of trauma bond, a Stockholm syndrome, that prevents the many from standing up to the few? Find out as Donald and I discuss in depth the extent of the bullying, the odd acceptance of this behavior by authority figures, and the negative repercussions felt throughout society at large. You can find out more about Donald's work and catch his most recent blog posts at www.donaldjeffries.wordpress.com. If you like what you're hearing, please like, subscribe, and share this podcast across your social media network. Find out more about The Shift, sign up for the newsletter, enjoy hours of free content, or subscribe for feature-length versions of these discussions at theshiftnow.com. You can also find us on Facebook and YouTube at The Shift with Doug McKenty, or on Twitter at DMcKenty. I'd like to thank author Donald Jeffries for agreeing to this interview, and thank you for helping to make the shift. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this 69th episode of The Shift. I'm happy to be joined today by Donald Jeffries. He is the author of the book Bullyocracy. This really gets into, I think, the heart of a lot of what's going on in our culture right now and has been going on for some time. And it just describes how bullying is such a huge part of the social fabric of what's happening in the United States and what's been happening for decades, how it starts in school, but you see it in college. You see it in the workplace. You see it in the police force. You see it in the medical field. You see it in acting. He goes on, and he has all of the examples that you could possibly need to really back it up. What's happening here in terms of the creation of this social hierarchy that's basically based on this bullyocracy. And so I'm excited to talk about this today. For those of you who have been checking out my Psychology of Lockdown series, sometimes I talk about how within the school system, and I usually just talk about the grading system in terms of if you follow the authority, you get an A, and if you don't, if you question authority, you get an F, that kind of shaming and humiliation that happens to those who question. But I think this whole bullying social hierarchy that we'll get into today is a huge part of it as well, and it kind of sets us up basically to live in an authoritarian state, or at the very least, to accept what authoritarians say or authority figures without really questioning and without getting triggered into a kind of a fight or flight situation based on shaming, based on humiliation, being the victim of bullying, that then causes many people to simply acquiesce to what authorities say without really thinking maybe this isn't the best choice for me or my family or my community. So thank you so much, Don, for coming on today. And do you just want to start off giving people a history of your work? I know you've done a lot of different stuff, and then maybe describe what attracted you to this idea of the bullyocracy and why you wrote a book about it.
Oh, thanks. I started out really investigating the JFK assassination primarily. As a teenager, I worked with Mark Lane's group. Mark Lane was the most famous critic of the Warren Commission, who wrote Rush to Judgment, and he was a mentor to me and a hero to me because he was a civil libertarian. And if you've read my social media posts even today, I'm still a civil libertarian, and there aren't very many of us left.
Oh,
And certainly the left doesn't welcome me anymore. So I was very interested in the JFK assassination, and I worked for his Citizens Committee of Inquiry. We lobbied for a new investigation. That kind of led me down other paths. Like RFK assassination, MLK assassination, and eventually things like Waco, Oklahoma City, 9/11, all
mhm.
the big issues. And that's when I wrote my first nonfiction books. I'm primarily a novelist, or is what I wanted to be. So my first book was The Unreals, which is the only fiction I've had published to date, and was well received critically. I got a lot of people that liked it, but it's a very small publisher. So I just said, well, I'm going to try nonfiction. I know the JFK assassination. So I just started writing, basically what became my platform that you see on a lot of other interviews and social media, and started with Hidden History, which is the JFK assassination up to the Obama years, because I had it published before Trump came on the scene. And then I wrote Survival of the Richest, which is my economic book, and that's kind of my left wing manifesto. But the left seems to hate it
Mhm.
because I
Right.
talk about immigration and things like that, and they don't want to talk about that and the impact on wages and worker blue collar wages and benefits that it's had. And so that was very critically. I probably has the most critical praise of any of my books, but it does not sell well. Hidden History sells real well. Then Crimes and Cover-ups in American Politics, 1776 to 1963, was basically a prequel to Hidden History, and I go from the American Revolution up to the Kennedy assassination. Ron Paul wrote a foreword to that, very gratified, a hero of mine.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah, it was wonderful. So, and then I wrote Bullyocracy, which is, people said they kind of wonder, but I'm interested in lots of things. I'm not just interested in politics, and I had been interested in this issue for a while, not because I was bullied, but I saw things, and it wasn't anywhere near as bad back then. But I'm always amazed at how the left, especially again, which is where I am, they talk about they empathize with bullied victims. They talk about zero tolerance and all that. And as it works in the real world, is that those zero tolerance policies actually are completely meaningless. And in fact, schools that have them have more prevalence of bullying than anywhere else, because it's typical woke leftness where they don't mean what they say. So what it ends up being is that then you actually have them cracking down. And of course, school systems, this bullying happens primarily in school systems, which are by and large incredibly leftist in nature. Most teachers are very liberal. Most school administrators are, especially in the big cities. So if they really are empathizing with what they call marginalized people, no one's more marginalized than say a kid with a handicap or a disability that target signals that they should be bullied, kind of to aggressive kids. So they should be protecting those kids. They don't. They do the exact opposite. But if
Hmm.
some kid in a high school takes an aspirin, they can be thrown out of school, and it's happened. If they are, mark, say, and this actually happened. A little girl, I think she was 12 or something, wrote in magic marker on her desk, "I love you," or "love my friend," or something. She was expelled from school. Kids have been arrested for burping in class. I mean, this kind of crazy police state stuff. But at the same time, vicious bullying happens inside of these classrooms. There was a girl in high school that was knocked unconscious in a classroom, and nobody questions it. Nobody questions because, of course, the first thing I did when I read these reports, that my first impulse is, was there a teacher in the classroom?
Right.
How did this happen? And nobody ever questions the teacher. And you see now, look at the situation we're in now, where the schools are still locked down. The teachers unions, they don't want to go back to work. They're doing everything they can to not go back to work. And these are the people, and that's again why Bullyocracy, I've gotten more personal feedback from this than any of my other books, even though it hasn't sold that well. But it's because so many people can relate to it. So many people were bullied or have someone who was bullied, or their kids were bullied, their siblings. I hear from these people all the time. They're horrendous stories, that I
Right.
came after the book was published. I would have loved to include them in the book. So this is a subject that touches everyone, and they're very grateful that someone finally. I've had several people say, finally, somebody wrote a book, exposing all this, because no one has. Everybody else works with these schools. The problem is the school system. Just as if it happens in the workplaces, it's because the workplaces and the people that run those workplaces enable it. And largely, they're the same psychopathic type of personalities that allowed it to happen at the school level.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned before the show, when I first started reading the book, I thought we were going to kind of be talking a little bit more about the cancel culture and some of the political
Right.
dialogue that's going on. And then as I started getting into it, I was like, okay, this is very specifically about bullying that goes on in institutions, specifically high schools and the school age children. But then you branch off and really include lots of sectors of society and the workplace later on in the book. And all of a sudden, as I'm getting through it, I'm realizing like this is the issue. I mean, this is the issue that we should all be talking about, because I think that this kind of psychology, this hierarchical popularity contest that's going on inside all of the schools, this social structure that as you say, all of the adults seem to enable, like over and over again there were stories about bullies that would just pick on a kid. Clearly there must have been a teacher somewhere around, and then as soon as the victim fights back, the teacher shows up, and as often as not, it's the victim that gets suspended for fighting in school, or if something escalates into serious violence or even rape, I mean, and you just have example after example, then the system is consistently victim shaming and going very leniently on the people that are perpetrating the bullying. It's just such a fascinating story, and it brought me back to my own high school experience. Why don't we just dwell a little bit on this whole, the bullyocracy in school, where you really delve into the kind of the athlete, the jock, the popular kid, the cheerleader, and then sort of the rest of the school, and how this hierarchy is developed within the school system and then perpetuated by the adults. It's something that fascinated me when I was in high school. I mean, when I was in
Right.
high school, I would just ask myself, I thought I was supposed to be here to learn. And clearly the teachers, the administrators, and I went to a high school in Texas where it was all football all the time. And everybody, we were forced to go to the pep rallies. If you didn't go to the pep rally, then you were truant. You would get punished.
Yeah.
I mean, and all the teachers participated. Like, it was just
Yeah.
completely normal to have this hierarchical structure and to give preferential treatment to the popular kids.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, the pep rallies, the homecoming court,
Right.
prom queen and king, things, powder puff football, all these things that are in their traditions at every school. They exist. Their purpose is to continue to enable those who have risen to popularity. And I've there's a lot of parallels between Bullyocracy, my book, and Survival of the Richest, where I talk about how the system is rigged against everyone except for the very wealthy. And it's the same
Right.
kind of thing. And for all intents and purposes, the very popular kids in the schools are the wealthy, the 1% of their schools. So the rules don't apply to them. If they commit some transgressions, the system covers up for them.
Right.
And the system is constantly giving accolades to these same people, much as we see in our society. The people that already have too much continue to get more, while people struggle at the bottom. It's the exact same way in school. The kids who are already are basking in the glow of what is really celebrity or fame in their in their various little ponds. They're
Absolutely.
basically they're basking in it. So they have these ceremonies, whether it's a pep rally or award ceremonies, where they can, come up with more, to call them up on stage to be cheered even more. This is constant. I mean, it's ridiculous that you should have to go to a pep rally and cheer on. I mean, what if you don't like football or something?
Right.
So I mean, they would never do that for the Glee Club or the audiovisual squad or
Well, that's
something.
exactly right. Or the academic decathlon, or and it's
Right.
people that are actually studying and learning
Yes.
for
Yeah.
God's sakes in a school.
Yes. Well, exactly, and I bring that up. That you analyze these things, and I could. It's very, very seldom that you're going to find anybody who. I mean, the idea of school is supposed to be to achieve, within that system, would be to get the best grades, right? Or what I would think,
Right.
to academic excellence. But academic excellence is there. It doesn't correlate to any kind of popularity. The only way anybody who's like the valedictorian or that could happen. It's almost always with a female, because a lot of the girls that are really popular also are great students. They're at National Honor Society and so
Mhm.
forth. And they're Eddie Haskell types. They can fool all the adults, but they're viciously tormenting some girls behind the scenes. It's what they do. That's the mean girls phenomenon. Boys,
Right.
not so much, because most of the football players and stuff, they don't care. It's part of their shtick to not get good grades, I guess. But the idea should, if anybody should be popular in school, you'd think it would be the people, the straight A student, or
Right.
I mean, because I mean, and we still might not like that. The average students, stupid straight A guy, whatever, kiss up, but we can at least rationalize it a little bit. But that's not the way the system works. The hierarchy promotes the people who are in a few crucial areas, and typically related to sports, or just simply to physical looks. If you're a good-looking girl,
Right.
odds are you're going to be popular. If you have money, maybe in some schools, but most of the time, if you're good, typically in just two sports, football or basketball. Those are the sports that dominate high school. I guess baseball in some areas, wrestling maybe in some places of the Midwest, but other sports not so much, and no other endeavor like drama. You think no drama? The drama people are made fun of a lot,
Right.
ironically. And as I point out in the book, so many of the celebrities we see who obviously excelled at drama, actors, were big jocks and popular people in school, and people you wouldn't think. Rosie O'Donnell was her homecoming queen.
Hmm.
Pee Wee Herman was a great high school wrestler.
Right.
Woody Allen was a great basketball and baseball player in high school. So it's people that you don't even think of. Well, wait a minute, really? That's but you. So basically, my premise was that the reason why it never gets changed is because the people that run our society, by and large, are those kids who were popular in high school, and then they become popular in life. And one of the
Mhm.
saddest studies, and it's the myth we've cherished for a long time, is that, well, the high school quarterback, he may torment the nerd with the pocket protector, or this the science geek or whatever. He may torment him in school and give him wedgies or whatever. But later on, that nerd will be bossing him around, because the high school, the big jock will peak out in high school. That's where, but unfortunately, the statistics don't show that. They show that the more popular you are in high school, the more successful you tend to be in life. And really, I draw the correlation between popularity in high school and success in adult life, because basically, to be popular in high school is really the only success. That's achieving success at that level. What else can you do at that point? You've succeeded. You
Mhm.
become very popular. You become one of the big men or big women on campus, and so it's. I think it's, and this is where why so many people have trouble that other than the people who were bullied or experienced this, they love what I'm saying because they know it's true. But any of the so-called educators, the so-called anti-bullying experts who don't like what I'm saying at all, because they're not really trying to stop bullying. Again, this is all a show. I don't know what they're trying to do, and I think it's part of the virtue signaling world. They're signaling they care, but they don't want to stop the problem.
Yeah.
And if they wanted to do it, they would look at the root cause, which is why, or if you can't have a very small portion of your student body be popular and be lauded by people without having a corresponding unpopular group, because not everyone can't be beautiful unless you have an ugliness to contrast it with. You can't have popularity without unpopularity, so you have to have that trench coat mafia and the other side. And more you're seeing that they're adorning themselves too, where the jocks get to wear their Letterman sweaters, Letterman jackets to school, their football jerseys every Friday in every school across the country.
Yeah.
The cheerleaders wear their uniforms. So in case you don't know who the popular kids are, we're going to let you know.
Right.
In case you don't know, hey, these are the popular kids. And then just think about that. What is the point of that? I mean, I understand what it does for the handful of people that get to do it, but it builds their ego up, and that's why you see so many of these popular kids that become conceited and arrogant, because you can't really blame them. Their
Sure.
egos are being stroked to such an extent. They're being singled out as, I'm special. I'm the only one that's wearing this cool outfit in class, and everybody knows me now, who I am. And I have tons of people who know me, but I don't know them. So you can't really expect them to have any other kind of attitude. But it's the adults that are enabling that, because, as I show over and over again in the book, is when there's some kind of altercation, if there's a popular kid involved, that adult is almost always going to side with the popular kid or try to negate it. And then if the kid who's maybe troubled, has some issues, fights back, as you say, every time they somehow suddenly they're awake and they catch that. They
Right.
missed all the bullying. But
Right.
it's a horrible situation. But it's obviously the people that graduated from being popular in high school to becoming successful in life and running our society, basically, whether it's business,
Yeah.
whether it's the entertainment world, the sports world. These people are in charge, so they're not going to change things because the system worked really great for them.
What really amazes me is with the amount of enabling that's happening in the society that I mean, you just have examples over and over again. You had no dearth of material to
No,
work with, and just the amount of the adults. And these are adults they're middle class teachers. They're not the successful businessmen or the CEOs or the athletes that ended up making it. I mean, these are people who clearly probably weren't even in that popular class in high school,
yeah,
and yet they become teachers and they want to perpetuate it. And that's something that, I mean, I'll just tell you this story because it's precisely because of this emotional environment that I decided to homeschool my children. Right? I was just like, I don't want them to have to deal with any of this at all. And consistently over and over again, as my kid would become 5 or 6 years old, and they'd say, "Hey, people would just tell me, what school is he going to go to?" And I'd say, "Well, we're homeschooling, right?"
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then over and over again, I got the same response. Well, how are they going to get socialized? You
Right.
know,
Mhm,
and
yeah.
so it's considered by many adults, including the ones that were victimized in the high school environment, in that hierarchical environment, who it's like this. You mentioned in the book the Stockholm syndrome, that
Mhm.
even the people that are victimized by the process still somehow cling to it as it must have value and you must endure. Again, in the book, you also kind of mention this whole, it toughens you up to be bullied and picked on, and that's how you become stronger. And this,
Mhm.
and people would say socialization is what they call it. And I'm like, you mean throwing my kid into a situation where in adult life where you deal with people of all ages, you want me to
Mhm.
throw my kid in a situation where they're in
Right.
with people of the same ages in essentially a Lord of the Flies environment where the kids can beat up on them and there's all these wild,
Right.
social hierarchies going on that make no sense.
Yeah.
But people love it. They just are, it's a psychological conditioning, and I think it's really foundational to the whole of our culture. I mean, I'm so glad that
Yeah.
you wrote this book because it does target something that it's like everybody wants to cover up. It's like the evil underbelly
I
of
appreciate that.
the foundations of the culture that nobody wants to talk about and everyone wants to cover up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that in the past, and if there's a reason I think why I'm drawn to this subject, it's probably because my niece was born with Down syndrome. I talk about it in the book
Hmm.
when I was about 11 or 12 years old, and it had a huge impact on me because I saw in my own life the way not just kids but adults, the ones you talk about, the fine, upstanding, middle class adults would treat her, and it's just astonishing. And that was, that opened my eyes just
Yeah.
because I could not believe that people could act that way, that adults could act that way. So now when you hear people cavalierly saying retard and stuff, I cringe at it. Of course, I'm the last thing I am is a social justice warrior, so I don't want to ban people from saying it, but that's my word that really sets me up because
Yeah.
because they're the most talk about marginalized people. So, but before that, like when she was born, my sister, everybody advised her to put her away in an institution because again, and that's what they typically did with people with Down syndrome or other developmental disabilities. They hid them away, and what you see is, I think that's what our society, the worst victims of the social hierarchy are people. I talk about them a lot in the book. You can go on online forums and read about it, and I've been communicated with by a few of them. The worst, who had the worst imaginable things that happened to them in school that they simply could not. And I can understand, not everybody's real strong,
Yeah.
that they cannot have, just like some people can rise above, like having a real abusive childhood. They can rise above having a crappy family environment and go on and lead great lives. Most people can't. Most people can't rent that. So people that were emotionally, and there are middle-aged people out there, and you can read about them, and I've talked to some that still like wake up screaming every day, that are 60, 70 years old over what happened when
Right.
they were kids,
Yeah.
because it scarred their lives. They were never able to marry. Some of them probably are still virgins. They couldn't have any kind of relationship because they were scared to relate to people, and they had that whatever, that oddness or weirdness that was, basically, it might as well have been, stamped on them. So they were, and as adults, again, we think this ends. It doesn't end. Those are the kind of people. Those people still exist, and around every cubicle, there's somebody. And the enablers, the people that like us, maybe like, and I was a background player in high school. I didn't like the vast majority of people. I was just there. I didn't want to be there,
Right.
but so I was the audience. Most people hate school because it's boring, and it's another thing. I could write a thesis on that. About how bad the schools are, how just
Sure.
incredibly boring it is, and how they fail to really. I mean, everything I've learned in my life was outside. I learned almost nothing in public education. I educated myself, and I think
Yeah.
most people do that. So they really are horrible at what they do. I mean, but they do create obedient serfs to the state, as you know. People that obey authority, but they also teach you some. The most enlightened things I found were just anonymous souls on the internet that would talk about and just analyze school, and they did it much more brilliantly than any of these educators do. But one of them talked about, this is it serves schools serve a purpose that they're most young people's first experience with a government institution, and
Hmm.
they realize at this time it gets emblazoned in their mind that this is the way it is. Authority figures are flawed. They're not going to be able to correct misbehavior in the right part. They're usually going to be so clueless that they blame the wrong person, and they're not there to protect the vulnerable. So that's the way government at large is. Government is not
Right.
going to protect the vulnerable. Government is going to see that the rewards go to the same people, and they're not going to punish those that need to be punished. And often will punish those who are completely innocent or victims. So
Yeah.
it's so I think it's just a microcosm of the way we see society even today.
The cover-ups that you describe in the book are just unbelievable, where, I mean, a college athlete will get, I mean, gang raping a poor woman, and then she tries to come out with her story, and she's the one that's getting shamed, and then
Yep.
even the coach, certainly, but then the educational institution, and then the cops, and then the lawyers, and then the judges will all poo-poo it and put it down and cover it up, and then the
And
people that,
the
yeah,
community. Yeah.
right, right, it's just phenomenal. um I don't, I just want to impart to the audience how this system is so ingrained in everyone that they think that I think that it's like perpetuating this cycle of violence. They think it must serve some purpose of toughening us up. And so they go to these great lengths of covering it up and pretending like it's not happening, or pretending like, it's just part of the growing process or something. But the level of violence that you describe is I mean, at the very least, when someone's in a high school situation and you describe, 4 or 5 years of bullying, you're going to get some kind of post-traumatic stress from long-term, bullying like that. But I mean, then the individual acts of violence, which include, hazing that includes rape
Yeah,
and murder. And still these people are getting light sentences and getting off, and like
yeah,
boys will be boys. And you talk about how people joke. It's a joke. It was just a practical joke. It was a
right.
prank. It went a little too far. We're so sorry. And then nothing happens, when clearly,
Yeah,
like, you just murdered someone or you just gang raped someone. Like, what's
exactly.
going on?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and you definitely see this, and there is that attitude. Well, it just happens. It's life. And they'll a lot of times these bullies. I have the story of a fairly successful writer that talked about. He wrote an article on the internet about being invited, I think, to his 20th school reunion or something, and
Mm.
he just it was wonderful if you read it what he wrote. That he said, why the hell would you think I would want to see you again? Are you insane? But I think a lot, maybe they don't even remember, or they don't. Again, they try to rationalize it because
Yeah.
again they're doing awful things. But the problem is that's why I talk about when they used to lock away people who were born with awful handicaps. They just shut them away from the world. They put them in monasteries and things like nunneries and things like that.
Uh-huh.
Well, the Kennedy kids, was that way. But uh, now we tend to when we have these worst victims of bullying later on in life, they're essentially shut away because we don't and we just call them weirdos, or we say, and then a lot, maybe they'll turn into serial killers or something, so we don't
Sure.
think of what might have triggered that. And that's why I talk about the school shooters. Every one of those school shooters, this is of course not to to try to defend school shooters, but there's always something that triggers these things. So we understand, for instance, if a serial killer is violently abused, which most of them are coming from horrible backgrounds by their parents or whatever, they have a terror. We understand, well, that's probably what was responsible for maybe making them into this monster. But it's the same thing. If you go through a horribly traumatic experience through, some of these kids are. I've read things where they said, I was bullied every day of my life from kindergarten through 12th grade.
Yeah.
So I mean, just imagine, and you have to go there. This is a place, and you try. A lot of these kids, some of them don't feel they can tell their parents, or their parents just assume they're exaggerating, as you talked about, teachers and grading and so forth. It's now we're understanding, and I put some of the evidence in the book there that teachers do favor. They
Hmm.
aren't fair in grades. So there's evidence for that. But you've heard so many kids say, "Well, the teacher doesn't like me." They're complaining. Well, and their parents, I just shut up. And most parents, again, are just clueless. They're not like you. Or they're increasing number of people that are homeschooling now, and
Yeah.
essentially, of course, and this is what's kind of ironic about this book now is that they're all essentially homeschooled at this point, with schools being shut down until
Right.
further notice. So I'm not sure, what's going to go on, if the social hierarchy will be broken that way or what. But so maybe something good will come out of it. But it's these things, and when they have these social rituals, and they're I understand it's dear to their hearts, and it's wonderful for the people who benefit by them. And they would be pretty cool if they were democratic and open to everyone, but they're not.
Yeah.
They're everybody knows, whether it's homecoming queen or prom queen, whatever. Everybody knows who's. It's a handful of the most popular, basically Oscar nominees, if you will, at that level. So everybody knows who. You're not going to vote for your geeky friend, although sometimes they do that. They actually promote that as a laugh to make fun of them further.
Yeah.
They've done that many times before. And again, the school enables all this, and none of this could happen without the school authorities participating. That's why I indict where I can. I name the names because over and over again, parents, and the worst, of course, is when I talk to too many parents whose kids have killed themselves. So,
Yeah.
to be driven to suicide when you're not even a teenager, these are prepubescent kids in some cases. Uh, when you're driven to suicide by what's happening to you at school, I mean, that ought to, that doesn't warrant like national congressional hearings
Right.
and the education community looking at themselves. I don't know what would, but they don't. They just ignore it. They sweep it under a rug, and they don't understand what they've left with these lives. In many cases, there was one. I don't have the name in front of me, but there was one little boy that was very young, maybe 11 or something, that killed himself. His parents started an anti-bullying organization in his honor, in his name. Then the father ended up killing himself after a couple years.
Yeah.
I mean, just these are man, and there's other things have happened where one sibling killed themselves a couple years later, another one does because they can't deal with it. So there's a residual effect, and and then of course you wind up with the just the lonely people that we talked about, the people that are hidden away, like the people were that were mentally retarded in the old days, where they can't really whatever jobs they it's very menial. They have no relationships. They're all by themselves. Their quality of life is horrible, and they're left with these terrible memories every day. I mean, how we all live with regrets, but just imagine waking up and screaming, as some of these people describe doing, something that happened 50, 60 years ago. I mean,
Right.
that shouldn't happen in any society. And most of the experts would basically tell them to toughen up. And as I pointed out, I don't. I think it can be argued that that kind of abuse, to the extent that it damages you to that degree, is at least as injurious as sexual abuse would be. We don't tell if a kid says he was sexually abused or she was sexually abused at a very young age. We don't tell them. We understand why that scarred them. We don't
Yeah.
sit there and say,
Right.
"Oh, toughen up." Stuff happens. Okay, you had a perverted uncle. Sorry. No, nobody would say that, but they do say that to bullied victims.
Mhm.
When in many cases, especially the when you do the sexual stuff, when they're inserting things up their butts that they do so many of these kids that they did, sometimes injuring in the process. But if that was just done by an uncle to to an underage niece or something, we wouldn't look at it the same way. We
Yeah.
wouldn't look and say, well, he was just playing around. No, why is it playing around in one instance and not the other? So we need to look at this a different way. But unfortunately, I'm disillusioned because I had, I communicated with some of these so-called anti-bullying experts, and they make you realize why the problem will never be solved, because they are on the side of the bullies always, much as the teachers and the principals are. There's nobody other than myself, to what little platform I have. There is nobody else that has any kind of a platform that is really taking up for these bullied victims.
It's just amazing to me. I remember when Columbine happened, and I
Yeah,
heard about it that day, and the very first thought I had was like, well, it was bound to happen. Like I was like, and then the next thought that I had was, well, now we're going to have a national conversation about the psychology, the toxic psychological environment in these schools, because it's got to come out in the open. I mean, I just, from my own personal experience, again, just flabbergasted. I just
yeah,
remember, I don't know why and I wasn't even particularly bullied. I mean, I think I was been thinking back on it as I was reading your book, and me and my group of friends who were, typically sort of the nerd class, I guess.
mm,
We developed a pretty sardonic wit, and I think that we were, but we had to
yeah,
almost become bullies. Now I'm thinking
yeah,
back about it, and I was like, I had to be a little bit of a bully myself, actually,
yeah, mm,
to keep and I still, there were instances of bullying, there were instances of hazing. I was in band for a year, and I used to wonder, even when I was in band, why don't we have a band concert and then between sets, the football players come out and play for 15 minutes, and then they get off, and then we get to do our band.
yeah,
Like, because it
yeah,
just blew my mind that football was, clearly the driving factor
yeah.
in the whole school, and that the adults and the teachers, everybody was just in on this. And it was, I still don't fully understand it, but I saw how dysfunctional it was while I went through it. And then when Columbine happened, really, it was like, to me, it was a matter of time before something like this was going to happen. Now we're going to have a national conversation about, the unhealthy environment within the school systems, and none of that, no conversation whatsoever. If
No,
anything, like you say, blaming the kids. Oh, the kids had a terrible home life, and
yeah,
nothing to do with the school system, and
right.
certainly the teachers.
Well, you saw in Columbine, and I again I don't have the names in front of me, but there was a prominent guy that wrote a book, and he's been published many times as articles about Columbine, where he's trying to contradict all the information that was out there. They have tapes of these kids, uh, Siebold and I'm sorry, I forgot their names as well.
Yeah.
The two shooters, but they that talked about the awful that we're going to get back at them, not inviting. They were
Right.
clearly bullied. There's no
Right.
question about it. But it doesn't much as like today in the council culture. Evidence doesn't matter. So it doesn't matter what a tape says. It doesn't matter. It's what you feel. Well, apparently in this case, they feel that this wasn't a problem. It's more, and this is their answer typically will be, well, it's complicated. It's more than that. Maybe they had a bad home life because it's easy to blame the parents.
Hmm.
Maybe they had a home life. Maybe there were other issues and of course, I understand where nobody's excusing kids taking guns and blowing away, other kids. It's obviously but that should never happen.
Yeah.
And I think if you look in the backgrounds of those kids, you're going to find, and you can see, as I wrote, so in the book, I showed people how they scrub, much as like my political writing, they scrub the record. They get rid of the inconvenient evidence. So the evidence in all these cases shows the school shooter was bullied viciously. So that helped them. Now, of course, they had to be messed up in some way mentally to do that, to take that step. But clearly, they probably would not have taken that step without the vicious bullying. That seemed
Hmm.
to be what triggered them. But nobody wants to go there because, again, that interferes with, okay, well, who are they being bullied by? Not the audiovisual squad, not their fellow nerds.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
We know who is bullying them because we know, thank goodness, they finally admitted that, yeah, it is the popular kids that do the bullying, where, it's no longer you can't paint this picture of the troubled kid from the other side of the tracks who's bitter because his old man's a drunk and beats him up all the time. So he goes to school and takes it out on everybody else. Now,
Right.
they may be isolated examples of that, but for the most part, especially with females, since the female bullying is in many ways more psychologically scarring, and it's more prominent now. Like most of the people, what really got me started down this road, other than just feeling strongly about it, is I started seeing pictures of all these really, really attractive young girls that killed themselves,
Yeah.
and I couldn't. That didn't make any sense to me. It's like, wait a minute, why would a really good looking young teenage girl kill themselves? I mean, that's just, it made no sense. That would have never happened when I was in high school. So I started looking into the background, and I realized I'd never seen that movie Mean Girls, the Mean Girls phenomenon. And I started analyzing that stuff and realizing, okay, the reason they do is because they're hanging out with other good looking girls, and they start doing these psychological games with them.
Hmm.
Where they decide, the queen bee decides they're, her little court, they're going to pick on one of them and just mess with him. And in many cases, sometimes they do something stupid like sex something, or they send a picture topless or something, and then the popular boys pass it around. And it ends up they can't deal with humiliation, and they kill this. And almost every one of these cases, something like that happened.
Yeah.
But again, nobody is talking about it. I mean, they're acting like it's not going to happen again. And since I've written the book, there have see stories almost every day. People send them to me or I see them online. The problem is just the same. Now, it may have slowed down now, again, with schools being closed. But as long as schools are open, this stuff is happening. And what I've talked about, which is amazing, is that with all the police presence in schools, with security cameras everywhere, bullying should be documented always. They should be able to figure out, hey, this kid's telling the truth or not. And in most of the cases, no one talked about that. There was no police didn't say. In fact, I report on at least one instance where the police didn't examine the videotape because it wasn't relevant. Wasn't relevant?
Right.
That would show you, who was telling the truth or what the circumstances were. But because they're not interested in in solving anything, because they know who the bullies are, they know who the aggressors are, and they don't want to go there because that would disrupt the hierarchy. And it's basically almost like kids knowing their place. The
Yeah.
kid who's unpopular and nobody knows, he can't be allowed to win at anything or to beat a really popular kid at anything. And that's the way the system works. It's much as like, a file clerk is not going to be able to ever beat a CEO at anything in our society. In both cases, you're dealing with rigged systems. And in many cases, the
Yeah.
social hierarchy, in many ways, prepares us for the adult rigged marketplace that I talk about in Survival of the Richest.
Yeah, I mean that's you kind of knock on the door here, but I started thinking as I was reading it that we really live in I mean, I've thought this for a while that our economy is basically set up with a cartel system. It's like the biggest gang won, 200 years ago or
Yeah.
500 years ago with
Mhm.
colonization or however you want to describe it. And now we have this cartel system where these guys on the top, uh, control most of the resources, and the rest of us are serfs, basically, that kind of work for this corporate system right now. And so I think that, but then on this psychological level, it's just wild that you're seeing that this lawlessness, in effect, this criminal culture starts in high school, where
Yep.
the 1%, if you will, or the popular kids can get away literally with murder.
Yeah.
Like a 16, 17-year-old football player rapes someone,
Yeah.
or they gang rape someone, or they haze someone to near death, or kill someone even. And like you say, evidence that all of the adults in the school administration and the cops and the judges and everyone in the community will sweep it under the rug. Well, you're a member of the popular class, so
Yeah.
you can do whatever you want. I mean, I think there was a sentence in your book where you basically said, if we let these people get away with murder, then why do we even have laws at all? Like, why, and it
Yeah.
does seem
Exactly.
like there are, the
Yeah.
prosecution is very selective. If you're a victim, then they'll throw the book at you, like
Yeah.
you talk about with the kids that are burping in class and getting arrested by this
Yeah.
surveillance state, this militarized police state that's become a
Right.
public school. But if you're a popular
Exactly.
kid, you can literally get away with murder. It's nuts.
Yeah. No, and again, I think it prepares us for and I think for those of us who question why, for instance, no deep state criminals ever get are prosecuted or
Right,
arrested. Well,
right.
you can see, I mean, they can't even prosecute, or they can't even punish, or a high school kid that is popular enough to do the worst thing possible, to rape someone.
Yeah,
And I don't know how many have murdered, but I guess they could theoretically. But I'm one in many cases. I talk about and again, the race lines are blurred here always too. There's so many stories where you hear the woke culture that everything is anti-white and racist, racist, racist. Well, one of my favorites, not favorite, but one of the most egregious stories was a black athlete who was, I guess, was obviously a lesser athlete, or I think wouldn't have happened to him, but his body was found rolled up in the school gymnasium, dead,
hmm,
during a school day. And, literally, I mean, now, I think when we send our kids to school, we have a right to expect that they're not going to be, die in the gymnasium, or something under unclear circumstances. But that's what happened. And his parents, again, these are black people. I don't see Al Sharpton or Jesse Jackson. I mean, that's the kind of case maybe you ought to question. Wait a minute. I mean, I don't think it's racism, because it happens to all races, but it's the system. Something happened where he had been complaining about other football players harassing him to no avail. The same kind of thing we see all the time. And his body, and they actually came up with a ridiculous excuse and claimed he'd lost his shoe, or his shoe had fallen off, and he reached into the mat and fell in and got rolled up in it. That's how. I mean,
right.
this is like one of the, that Gary Webb shot himself twice in the head,
Yeah.
or the guy that Donald Trump put in charge of lowering pharmacy prescription prices last year. He was found dead, and they claimed he beat himself to death, blunt force trauma all over his body. This is
Right.
what this is a fetus. So that's at that level. And again, it prepares people for it. His family can do nothing. Again, even though in political correctness, they've got all the trump cards. This is a
Yeah.
black kid that died, but they can't get anywhere. So it doesn't matter. That social hierarchy, it's above all that. But it's all about covering up, and they let the worst things happen. There was another kid that drowned in a school pool. And I said, first of all, not that many schools have pools, but I think the least you can expect is if they go into a pool, that someone will be there
Yeah.
to be able to save them if that happens. But and again, the teacher that was present or whatever, they're never questioned. To me, that's who should be held responsible. How
Yeah.
did you let that happen? Explain that. If that's my kid, I want to know that. I think the least we can expect when send our kids to school is that they don't drown at school premises. But these things happen all the time. Not exactly like that, but just as horrible things happen. There's another case and she happened to be black, but again, no, but she came home from kindergarten, looked like she'd gone 15 rounds in a heavyweight prize fight. The mother asked the school, and they said, "Oh, she fell." I mean,
Right.
and these things, it's what, but nobody, and I don't even understand that because she was really little. There was another case of a kid at kindergarten, I think, who was some kid, some bully. And again, kindergartners should be monitored constantly on the playground. You can't tell me adults don't see what's happening. I mean, I know I used to go volunteer with my kids all the time. I saw things constantly. There's no way the teachers missed that. The kid kept daring him to pull down his pants in front of the class. So of course, eventually he bullied him into doing it. He said, if you don't do it, I'm going to pull him down for you. So as soon as he pulled his pants down, then the teachers woke up
Right.
and took the basically arrested him, took the kindergartner back to class for indecent exposure. So again, if you have a real investigation like that, if you have rational, honest people in charge, the first thing they do is they bring every adult, whether it was a teacher, assistant, whatever, in and say, okay, how did this happen? How did you possibly miss? That couldn't have been a quiet thing with the kid daring him to pull his pants down. I'm going to pull it down for you.
Yeah.
You think there'd be one tattletale saying, Miss so and so, he's going to, you'd think that, but obviously, and then you sprung into action, and this happens over and over and over again. These are the things we need to do in all these cases, but we don't. And you have one of my favorite example to show the extent of the problem is there was a viral video a couple years ago where a middle-aged man, maybe 40s, I don't know, 50 maybe, came into a school board meeting and was talking about how school bullying was a big problem and had been going on in that school district since he was a child. He said, I was bullied relentlessly. My head was stuck in the urinal, all these horrible things that happened. And he looked at the school board president. He said, and you were the one who did that to me.
Right.
This is the
Right.
school
Yeah.
superintendent of schools.
Wow.
And you could see he just he went right back to being a bully. And
Yeah.
that's the problem. Who knows how many other school superintendents did that to kids? So they're in charge.
Right.
And I don't know. Nobody, the media covers this up. I mean, the media can't tell the truth about anything. If you've read my political writing, you know what I think of them. We don't have any investigative
It's
journalists,
crazy
so they
right now.
instinctively stick up for the schools.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is, especially now. So they can't. These should be stories that should have been an expose. How
Yeah.
did this guy get to be a school superintendent when he did such horrible things when he's a kid? No, it's
Well,
swept under the rug. I'm sure nothing happened, and it's just I don't know. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say you tell
Go ahead.
stories in the book where 50 the parents will call, and I can only imagine what it must feel like to be a parent of a child who's bullied, because the parents,
Yeah.
in some cases, I mean, calling the school dozens of times, and the school will
Yes.
say, like, I mean, you've talked about, we have a zero tolerance policy and we haven't seen anything and nothing's going on, and I mean,
Right.
dozens the 30th or 40th time you're talking to the principal because your kids come home with the bloody
Yeah.
nose or whatever, or
Right.
crying because they've been emotionally abused, and the people aren't doing anything about it. It's just outrageous.
No.
It really is.
It's incredible. And if they can't tell the truth about, for instance, there's a case that really got to me, a 12-year-old Rebecca Sedgwick, who they claim jumped off a water tower, 12 years old, killed herself in Florida.
Yeah.
And I read that it got a lot of press. I corresponded with her mother off and on, and I went back and forth. I got the official police report on the investigation from an anti-bullying expert who was kind enough to share it with me, but she's completely deluded. She shared it with me because she thought it would make me realize the error of my ways.
Uh-huh.
Because the idea was, in this case, law enforcement Sheriff Grady Judd actually attempted to do his job. It was obvious who the two little girls were that were bullying this kid and tormenting her. It was obvious. It was documented everywhere on their social media posts and everything. I mean,
Yeah.
you wouldn't have to have any training in law enforcement to figure this out. But Grady Judd, because he actually, unlike most law enforcement, he actually tried to do his job and punished them in some way. He almost lost his job. The media attacked him relentlessly.
Yeah.
He had to end up dropping charges against him. And if you just read the communication between me and this, it was unbelievable because and I said, look, after you sent me the police reports, I'm obviously the police report shows that everyone was aware these two girls were doing it. And that, in fact, the main ringleader, the entire school was terrified of her, had been for years. And again, this is why the rabbit hole goes deeper, because these are 12-year-old. The hierarchy is just starting to form.
Yeah.
And she clearly wasn't a popular football player or anything. So what is going on here? How is this? How are they failing to basically a bull in a china shop that's running around their school doing these awful things that everybody knows? But I have one that's even, earlier than that. There was and it was another one of the landmark cases that really got my attention. It was in Cleveland back in maybe 2000 or so, where there a kindergartner, probably the most problematic kindergarten in the history of the world. Now he came from the worst. He was living in a crack house with his uncle.
Yeah.
Both his parents were in prison. Social services have been contacted, and unlike when they're contacted about somebody that took an innocent picture of their 3-year-old in the bathtub, didn't spring into action, did nothing. Law enforcement refused to go even check the crack house. He had been expelled from kindergarten. He had attacked kids, including the little girl who he ended up killing. He had previously attacked her. Somehow he was still in class. And on that day, he brought a gun. He stole a gun from his uncle. This is a kindergartner, a gun and a knife to school. He was brandishing both of them openly in the classroom. Now,
Right.
you tell me how a teacher, you would have one eye on this kid all the time. I mean, this kid is the worst kindergarten in the history of the world, right? And nobody questioned who that teacher was. She did somehow she got the knife and took it away from him. She didn't even send him to the principal's office. So later that morning, he ends up shooting and killing this little girl,
Yeah.
and nobody says any. And then, of course, Bill Clinton, puts the finishing touches on. He was I guess it was the '90s, where he said something like, we talked about gun control. This gun control, of course, and then
Yeah. It always
then
goes to gun control.
and the district attorney. Yeah, exactly. And the district attorney said something like, "We need to all collectively hug this child." Nothing happened to him. He learned no lessons. I saw his Facebook page later. He's a gangster wannabe. He learned
Right.
absolutely nothing from it. So not that you would as a kindergartner, but it's just a tragedy. And the person allowed it to happen. First of all, the school system allowed it to happen. That he was not in some kind of in social services. It was a failure on all our institutions. And so they all cover up for each other instead of recognizing when they harass. And I know people that social services and child protective services have harassed for no reason. They're horrible. They're also associated with child sex trafficking, by the way. But but in this case, they should have been doing their job. They did nothing. He went to school, and the teacher was so asleep at the switch. She didn't. Or she, yeah, assuming it's a she. I don't even know, and nobody questioned her. And I was back then, even online, I was asking, and I got in arguments with people back then. Oh, what are you talking about? I said, how is this teacher not responsible?
Yeah.
But that's the problem. I asked that question over and over again, and nobody wants to blame the teachers. Nobody wants to blame the schools. And essentially the problem doesn't get solved because you're never blaming the people that are responsible.
It is amazing. It's amazing that we hold these people on pedestals, and despite what's actually really going on, it's almost like it's an unspoken rule that you're not allowed to be critical, or you're not allowed to criticize. I mean, it seems like in each one of these cases, the teachers are the first ones that should have clearly been aware. And it almost never comes back on the teachers. It's like then there's like the middleman, the principal, or even the superintendent that gets involved and says, no, we've investigated it.
Yeah.
Or you talk a lot of times, they'll say that's a privacy concern, we can't talk about it.
Yes.
And then all kinds of excuses. Will you talk a little bit about even these anti-bullying experts and the excuses that they come up with, to where the anti-bullying movement doesn't even actually get to the root of the problem, or try to solve some
No.
of these issues?
Nobody does, and that's why I said, I since I wrote the book, again, I've heard from lots of people. One of them I was so moved by, and the person has become I've hooked up with them on Facebook, but and social media, but her story was so heart tugging. And I wrote a post on my blog about a story that didn't make it into Bullyocracy, and it's all about her. But just to give you the low light of her career and to show you how, and this is in the '60s, the late '60s, where she was at an award ceremony. They told her she was going to get an award, but she had never gotten in her entire years. She was relentlessly bullied. She had polio, and that's how long ago this was. Where she says she wore the braces on her legs, was bullied by kids relentlessly because of that. Awful, awful stuff. So she's happy. She's saying, "Wow, I'm going to get an award." She tells her mom and her grandmother. They're excited. They come to the award ceremony. She's given an award by the principal of the school, who's in on the joke,
Right.
for least likely to succeed. She's humiliated in front of the entire school by the principal. What the principal is, he's the the head of the committee here.
Right.
And again, what and everybody laughs, because of course the principal's doing it. It must be okay to laugh, right? Think how that humiliates someone that they're not used to any attention except negative attention, so they're called up in front of the entire school and say you're the least likely to succeed. I mean, you might as well. I guess it could have been worse. They could have voted her ugliest or something, maybe. But that's pretty
Right.
bad. And so you wonder. She ended up leading seems to have led a pretty fairly a normal life. But some people are strong like that. But other people in those situations, they can never recover from it, and their lives are ruined. And the people that caused that did something, that principal should have never been allowed he should have been like a sexual predator. He shouldn't have been allowed near a playground. He should have been allowed nowhere near a school after that to participate in something like that. Psychological abuse,
Yeah.
bullying,
Yeah.
ultimate bullying. But again, these we don't know his name, and it's horrible. And there are other cases like that, and that's what gets me is that these people they're the ones that they don't apparently they don't feel any empathy because they are psychopathic personalities to varying degrees. They lead successful lives. They retire comfortably. On odds are they're much healthier than their victims. They live longer, live a better quality of life. Where the victims have to go through this torment of their horrible memories and wasted lives, and no one seems to care. Instead, they still laugh at them and still make fun of them, and I
Yeah.
don't know. I'll speak up for them if nobody else will, but it's amazing to me that no one else is jumping on this bandwagon.
Yeah, it's crazy. And then this notion of virtue, and I want to kind of, I guess what I want to do is with the last 10 minutes or so here, get into how this all affects our political dialogue right now and what's being called, the cancel culture, and,
Yes,
and then the virtue signaling that's going on. And I kind of, because it seems from what I've heard, you kind of come into this from the left, but you're enough of a civil libertarian. I mean, I'm actually, if I have a confirmation bias, I kind of come from a libertarian perspective,
right,
but I'm
right,
always trying to find that center place. And it is in this civil libertarian universe. And
yeah,
if no matter who I talk to, they could be a full-blown socialist or whatever, capital, wherever they are economically, if they understand the importance of civil liberties first, and then they hold on to those principles, I think this bigger picture is easier to see. We can all kind of go,
yeah,
okay, we're not following these principles and it's causing a lot of problems. So just as a setup, but I kind of wanted to
yeah,
get into the cancel culture and the
sure,
virtue signaling concepts, and why now we get shamed, or our political dialogue is clearly dysfunctional at this point, and then people are
right.
losing their jobs if they express a perspective that's not part of the mainstream narrative right now.
Right. Well, it's hard to call that anything more than vicious bullying. What
Right.
I call the virtue signalers, the the adherents of identity politics are doing now, and yeah, it's really the ultimate way. I mean, they're basically censoring show. And George Bernard Shaw a long time ago called said assassination was the ultimate form of censorship, but they're coming close to that because they're basically when you're getting someone fired and I was a leftist.
Hmm.
I'm not welcome in today's left, but I mean I'm friends with people like Cindy Sheehan, the International Peace Mom,
Hmm.
Cynthia McKinney, the former representative of Congress, Naomi Wolf, who wrote the forward to the paperback version of Survival of the Richest. All these people are not welcome by today's left either
Right.
because we care about civil liberties. We care about war and peace. We care about solving the problems, prison reform and judicial reform, things that the war on drugs, all this nonsense, victimless crimes, things that liberals used to care about, and that's what attracted me to the left. Today's left doesn't care at all about those things. They
Hmm.
exist pretty much solely to police speech and try to get people fired for saying things that offend them, and they're offended by everything. So, and again, these are ultimate bullies, the Karens, if you will, of the world or just they take something that somebody said, and in many ways it's a far worse form of bullying because it takes away people's livelihoods, where they don't think for a
Right.
second of okay, I'm going to report somebody he said something on social media. I mean, look what they're doing to this Congressman Marjorie Taylor Greene, where they officially uh, took her off of all the committees because of things she'd said on her own free time. And I've argued about this ad nauseum with leftists on social media. They don't care. They don't understand. They don't. And I've had to come to the conclusion that the majority of Americans don't believe in free speech. They really don't. The
Yeah,
left definitely doesn't. Today's
I
left
agree.
if they disagree with you, they don't think you're supposed to have free speech. You know, as a civil libertarian, I know that you have to fight for the speech you disagree with, otherwise, because if everybody doesn't have free speech, no one does. But they don't look at it that way. They look at it, yeah, you have free speech as long as you say something, and they come up with this absurd notion of hate speech,
Hmm.
which is incompatible with free speech. Because hate speech is, what does that even mean? It's a human emotion. You decide what hate speech is. So it infringes on free speech, and and now that this one party is in charge and there's not even any nominal opposition, we just have to hope that things don't go completely full authoritarian, because we're very close to that as it is, and they just don't rewrite the Bill of Rights because they don't believe in it.
Hmm.
And so the people in charge now, they could easily just say, we don't need this First Amendment thing because we don't agree with it anyhow. Everything they do makes it clear that they do not believe in free speech. So I can't get past that issue. I'm kind of a one trick pony on social media now, because I'm using that all the time to try to wake people on the good people up. And it's just not working because they have the Trump derangement syndrome. They're still thinking of that. And so anything that's against Trump, they justify. And
Yeah.
it's
I've
a shame
seen I've
because,
seen craziness where I'll post a
yeah,
scientific,
yeah,
peer-reviewed study. People will look up the scientists, go, they're a Trump supporter, so their science is wrong. I mean,
yeah,
I
yeah.
can't have a rational conversation about anything that if Trump
No,
maybe kind of agreed with it years
yeah,
ago, then it's just
right.
wrong. I mean,
Do you know who you quoted? It's like,
yeah,
oh, they
yeah.
were right.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
know. Like, can we have an actual conversation about the facts that have to
No.
do with the discussion? But
Yep.
no, because it gets in around the aura of something that may sound good for Trump. I mean, you have a
Yeah.
whole chapter. I've seen you actually on social media get kind of hammered for
Yeah.
sounding like you agreed with Trump, even though
Yes.
you have a part of the afterword, I think, or an appendix to the book where
Yeah.
you talk about how Trump is the quintessential bully. I mean,
Right. Right.
like
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
you're
And he
clearly
has
not a
that.
Trump supporter.
No, I'm not, and I don't have. But it doesn't matter, because the people that hate Trump,
Yeah,
they anything you do to attack those who hate him is considered support of Trump. So I mean, I got tired. I can't
it's
explain it any
frustrating.
better than I have. It's very frustrating,
I
but
know.
I
I'm
care
right
about
there with
civil
you.
liberties. I care about civil liberties. I care about free speech, and it's just very few Americans seem to these days. And so I just have to hope that we can keep it, because I want to still have the right to do whatever interviews I can do, like this one, and to write my blog and get my books published. And I don't know if that'll happen,
Right.
because if the cancel culture succeeds, they don't want these things. They don't want anything. They don't want any
Right.
opposition at all, and they want
Well,
everybody to be singing the same tune.
and it's so reminiscent of what we were discussing before, where these egregious violent activities by bullies will get glossed over or covered up by the mainstream. But then, as you described, the kid who eats the cookie into the shape of a gun will get arrested, or the kid who
Right.
brings an aspirin to
Right.
class. I mean, so the
Right.
microaggressions are just, you get hammered. And this is the same thing with hate speech. If I
Right.
didn't word that quite politically correct
Right.
enough, you're going to get hammered. You could get
Right.
fired. I mean, we had this actress that got fired today, or Dr. Simone Gold that, a few
Yes, I heard
months
about it.
ago coming out for
Yeah,
hydroxychloroquine, and she got, I mean, getting fired from your job because you have an
yep,
opinion that's different from others. But if you commit
it's amazing.
for committing a microaggression, but then again on these larger topics, the wars that are going on, or the
Yeah,
egregious behavior of the upper class, or I mean, what I would consider the big tech censorship,
right,
just gets
right.
glossed over and covered up like it's not that big of a deal.
Yes, and it is very much to be compared to what we see in high school, as far as bullying being enabled, and absurd little things like that
Mhm.
being punished. And it reflects society at large. But unfortunately, it's the nature of the people in charge. And for whatever reason, the vast majority of Americans seem satisfied with, or the
Yeah.
majority seem satisfied with it. The people in control do.
That's another thing that it's been fascinating to me about the whole thing is you can understand why the people that are in power, who then you look at their histories. Of course, they were the jocks and the popular kids, and so you see why they want to perpetuate the system. But it's amazing that the victims then
Yeah,
have this Stockholm syndrome clearly.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I guess they want to justify their suffering, like it must have been worth something, and
yeah.
everybody has to go through it. And
I learned
and
from it. Yeah, yeah.
and
It was it
so
was it
they
was it was
can't
an
see it.
educational experience. Yeah, it was a growth experience, educational experience. Yeah, I give some examples in the book of people that bullied and they justify it later. And I guess because they achieve some measure of success. they were, and so I guess they're in the system now. So they realize, hey, the system's pretty good, if you play along with it. And I
Right.
guess I can't get inside their minds, but all I know is that it should be those kinds of things happening should never happen to anyone, and nothing that bad that happens in an institution that our taxes pay for, and is enabled by people whose salaries we pay, should never be allowed to torture somebody enough to where decades later they're still impacted by it. We all ought to be
Right.
concerned about that, but unfortunately, it doesn't seem like that many people are.
Yeah. Sad state of affairs. Well,
Yeah.
thanks so much, at least in my opinion, for writing this book and
Oh, I appreciate
revealing
it.
that dark underbelly. And I hope that more people do check it out. I'll put it up. I have a little bookstore on my website with those people that I interview that have written books, and so I'll throw it up there. So if people are interested, they could find it there. Do you have any kind of closing words, or just let people know where they can find out more about your information, find your blog and all of your books?
Well, yeah, you can find me. I write my blog is keeping it unreal. It's donaldjeffries.wordpress.com. You can follow me on Twitter. I need to get more active there at Don Jeffries. Very active on Facebook. I'm real easy to find there. My books are. If you Google me, you'll find out more information probably than you want to know.
Yeah.
So,
Sounds good. All right. Well, thanks for coming on, Don. I'll let people know that you've been listening to The Shift. I've been your host, Doug McKenty, and you can find all of my stuff at theshiftnow.com. I'm also on Twitter at dmckenty, and I'm on Facebook and YouTube, and now a variety of other social media sites, Minds and Float, and some of the other ones, MeWe and Gab. So if you want to check me out, you can check me out there. But I'm trying to get more people to go to the website, theshiftnow.com. Sign up for the newsletter, and that way you'll get everything that I'm producing every week, and we can keep in touch that way. So thanks everybody for listening, and thanks a lot, Don, again for writing this book, and thanks for coming on the show. Great conversation.
well, thank you.
Well, all right, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. That was my conversation with Donald Jeffries. I started reading this book. When I first got it, I thought it was going to be a little bit more about the political conversation, the political dialogue we've been having, and the cancel culture that's been growing against people that, especially like probably most of us that are listening to this podcast, and myself included in that for sure, where our opinions typically go against the dominant political narrative. We're seeing so many people getting attacked and shamed and canceled and bullied, frankly, if we have an opinion that differs from the mainstream, from the government corporate narrative. And I was thinking that that's what Bullyocracy was going to be about. And then as I started reading it, and he starts to describe the high school culture, and he starts to get into the school culture with the popular kids and the bullying that happens on that level, I became more and more intrigued. Of course, I, like probably many of you, remember being in high school, and I went to a high school in Texas where that kind of football culture was really prominent. And I was just a little bit shocked, that we were forced to go to the pep rallies, that everybody had to almost, give the athletes this worship status, and the cheerleading and the popular kids and the whole hierarchical structure. It just sort of baffled me. I mean, I really thought that we were there to get an education, and that should have been the principal motivation behind the whole thing. But it was just amazing to me, even at that young age, as a teenager, to kind of look at the system and realize the adults just perpetuated this. I mean, they loved it. They assumed that it was just a part of growing up and a part of this great, process of being socialized in school. And some of the kids get to be popular, and they just don't really seem to think that much about the unpopular kids and what they're experiencing so much. But I've just heard it over and over again. As I mentioned in the discussion, I homeschooled my own children, and when people would ask me, are they in school? I'd say, well, they're homeschooled. Oftentimes I get this response, well, how are they going to get socialized? And it's like, socialized into what? I've always looked at it as kids getting thrown into this Lord of the Flies situation and then basically having to duke it out on their own, dealing with these outrageous social situations where the more powerful kids, the bullying kids, or the most often the popular kids, were getting all of these accolades and allowed to get away, sometimes, as in the case of this book, literally with murder. And I got to tell you guys, The examples in the book, which are many, many examples that he cites of the abusive behavior, it's way over the top. We're talking about, murder, rape, oftentimes just multiple examples of kids being driven to suicide by being humiliated by this kind of bullying behavior, just over and over and over again, and over and over again. Where the question that he kept asking was, where were the adults while this is happening? And the examples that he had, of course, where when the kid is getting picked on or bullied, there's no adult. But if the kid fights back, man, the teacher shows right up and says, "Hey, what's going on?" And then the victim will get in trouble. I mean, more often than not, uh, if the bullies are going to get published, then the victim gets published as well. Well, now you guys are fighting. The humiliation, the bullying behavior, that wasn't enough. But if you stand up against it, it becomes an altercation. Then everybody gets suspended or whatever. Everybody gets treated like it was all just everybody's fault. Not supposed to be fighting in school. When clearly these victims, again, often driven to suicide. And he gets into the books about the school shooting. And I brought up in the conversation that when Columbine happened, I remember thinking, yeah, I mean, I remember my high school experience, and I'm not surprised that, it's gotten to this level where kids are just being driven over the edge. We're forced to get into this environment. We're getting bullied every day. You know, Eventually, what's going to happen when there's no other out, and this psychological torture is just mounting and mounting. I mean, the anger is building. I thought for sure, finally, we were going to have this national conversation about the toxic environment in the public schools, and they just gloss over it. And he has, again, examples in the book. The school administrators not willing to talk about it, not willing to blame the bullying or the bully culture. The journalists glossing over this behavior. Oftentimes saying it was just sort of a practical joke gone wrong, or these kids will be kids, and they're too young really to be. We can't let it destroy their lives. A lot of times you hear like these football players or basketball players, well, they'll lose their scholarship, so let's not, after gang rape allegations, or the hazing that includes, just all kinds of horrible behavior, criminal behavior. And then, of course, this typical bullyocracy, this hierarchy that gets ingrained in everyone in high school. And that's why I think, again, going back to this idea that public schools are socializing us into our adult lives. Well, of course, then he cites the examples of the fraternity hazing, or, even police brutality, or, other social cliques in the workplace that are putting people down, that are victimizing certain individuals until they're just miserable in their lives and suicidal and depressed, and live in constant anxiety. He has examples of people that are in their 50s and 60s and have never healed emotionally from the trauma that they experienced in the public education system. And yet nobody talks about it. So it's really just, it is just actually kind of crazy. Like, I think it's this subconscious characteristic where it starts early in the school systems, where the 1% or the popular kids, the top of the bullyocracy, they can get away literally with murder, with rape, with beating, with picking on someone until they become suicidal and kill themselves. And yet the blame is never really put on the social system. Nobody's talking about, why does this bullyocracy exist? Why are we standing by while bullying behavior occurs? And then jumping into the fray when there is some kind of, when the victim actually starts standing up for themselves, or when, again, and I'm not justifying any kind of school shooting behavior, of course, but when somebody snaps to that extent, we have to wonder about the toxic situation that created that behavior. But nobody ever questions it. Nobody questions the teachers or the school system. It's almost as if that they're all above reproach. Even when we see teachers involved in the bullying, or examples of the bus drivers who are involved in the bullying, and then they don't get fired after the kid goes home and commits suicide. It all gets covered up, swept under the rug. And yet, as he mentions, smaller behaviors, playing cowboys and Indians, can get a kid suspended. Somebody that's taking aspirin in school will get suspended because they're having drugs in class. I mean, it's just outrageous where these huge crimes get covered up, swept under the rug, the bullying behavior, but then these microaggressions are now getting super targeted, and I think we're seeing this with the cancel culture and our in our political dialogue these days, where a microaggression is just the worst thing that you can do, and you'll get called out. But if you actually question the official narrative, then boom, you're the one that's getting bullied. You're the one that's getting shamed. And so I kind of want to urge people, if you're listening to this and if you like what you're hearing and you haven't yet, then please check out my Psychology of Lockdown series, because what we discuss in that series are that we equate why so many people are just following what the authority figure is saying, to why does a child in an abusive household with an abusive father figure or authority figure just follow along with what the father figure will say or the authority figure will say. And the idea is that we've all been traumatized to a certain extent. And if we don't heal from that traumatic event, then we're trauma bonded, or there's a type of Stockholm syndrome with the authority figure. And so we can continually be abused by authority and not stand up. And in fact, you know, snitch on the others who are standing up. If you're not wearing a mask, my God, calling the cops. If you're not doing what you're told, then you're being publicly shamed. You're being told that you're a narcissist or a psychopath because you disagree with what the authority figure is saying. And we're not actually having rational dialogue with people that have different opinions and coming to conclusions based on political dialogue. It's just, if you don't do what the authority figure says, then you're automatically wrong. And I think that a lot of this, and I brought it up in the Psychology of Lockdown series, where, well, in school, if you regurgitate what the authority figure says, you get an A. And if you don't, then you get an F. You're humiliated, you're shamed, you're embarrassed. You don't, you're not good enough to deserve the A. So they use this kind of carrot and stick psychology that ingrains in all of us already. Well, we better do what we're told. We better believe what the teacher says. We can't doubt what the teacher is saying, or else we'll get a failing grade. But what ends up happening, I think, is then when you add on top of this the bully culture that we all experience when we're in these situations for long periods of time, is the traumatizing event, the victimization that occurs within the bullyocracy, also then perpetuates as we get older into having to do what the authority figure says, whether it's in the hierarchy at work, where the bully becomes the boss, which happens, as Donald talks about in the book, very often, that these bullies in high school and college then become the bosses at work, or the political figures and end up being successful in politics. And then this bully culture just extends to that. And why is it that the mass of us have then learned to have this trauma response? Oh, we better do what the bully says, or else we're going to get picked on, humiliated, and it'll just get worse and worse. The authority figures will never show up to protect us. And so we have to learn how to handle it ourselves. And this is where it all ends up. Suddenly, just a few people, a few bullies, can really control the masses, because as soon as the authority figure tells us to do something, well, we better do it, or else we're going to get bullied. We're right back in high school. We're right back in that wounded inner child that says, if we don't do what the authority figure says, if we don't do what the abusive father figure says, we can't take care of ourselves. We're too weak. We're powerless. We're back in fight or flight mode. With all they have to do is pump us full of fear in the media. We're back in fight or flight mode, and then we're emotionally incapable of really standing up for ourselves. So I think that there's something behind this notion of bullyocracy that is really, really important, and we should all pay attention to. I was really happy to be able to hash this out with Donald, and I hope that you all think about checking out his book. It's going to be up at the bookstore. If you click on the bookstore on the website, you'll be able to check it out at theshiftnow.com. And I'll just give you, if you want to find out more about Donald's work, then please check him out. That's at donaldjeffries.wordpress.com. You can get his most recent blog post there. He's got everything archived going back years. Actually, a lot of interesting information just in the blog. Plus, he'll have all of his other books up on that website as well, so you can check him out or just Google his name, like he said. And of course, again, go to www.theshiftnow.com. I got hours of free content up there, and please think about subscribing to the newsletter or even subscribing for the long form feature length interviews. It's only $6 a month, and I appreciate it. Guys got to eat, so I'd appreciate it if you think about doing that. And of course, I think my next interview should be coming up next week. Sasha Stone. I'm really looking forward to that. We're going to do a deep dive into a lot of the spirituality around all of this, the spirituality, the spiritual practices of the upper classes, where this bullying behavior comes from, perhaps ultimately, and then I'm planning on discussing with him some of the spiritual practices of, say, the traditional Chinese, or the traditional Hindu, or many of the indigenous tribes that are still active around the world today, where their spiritual understanding differs from the type of spiritual practice or the consciousness, this colonizing consciousness that we experience here in the West, or those who have been colonized by the empire. So we're going to get into all of this spiritual information about all of that next week. So stay tuned for that. And thanks again, everybody. If you like what you're hearing, do think about sharing all this information on your social media. I am relying on people like you to spread the word about this. And of course, if you go to the website, I'm always trying to get people to go there, www.theshiftnow.com, and sign up for the newsletter. And then we'll be in direct contact, so we won't have to deal with the third party and the big tech censorship that's always ever present when you're trying to talk about subjects outside of the mainstream. So thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you soon. We'll see you again next week. Take care.